we're talking about where the Philippines has gone over the past half a century, essentially, no? Before we talk about Maharlika, we want to talk about the lost decades for the Philippines.
Yeah.
Just for
so, napaliwanag ni Richard yung how stark it was, diba? I just wanna show it visually. Kasi meron tayong mga visual people, obviously, dito sa sa podcast natin. May mga nakikinig, may mga nanonood. So here's a graph from the late, great, my favorite Filipino economist, Cayetano Dondon Paderanga, former NEDA secretary, of course, former professor also sa UP School of Econ. And prior to his death, he was working on a post-war history of the Philippines. And in this particular lecture from 2016 sa Kyoto University, where I was at that time working as a postdoc, nag-lecture siya at pinakita niya yung comparative takeoff points ng mga ASEAN countries. And nakita talaga natin na talaga napagtabunan yung Pilipinas. So, Richard, isn't this shocking to you, like when you look at it visually?
You know, what's interesting to me is that at least, okay, this is where, so let me share my side, because for me, the crucial years were actually the Maharlika years, right? Because if you look at least there's some improvement from 1991 onwards. Look at how flat the graph is from 1967, right? 65, 67. This is the beginning of Marcos until 1987. That's really the flat one. At least it picks up a little bit. Look at it towards 2011, and then under Aquino, it goes closer to $4,000. No, so actually the takeoff is from mid 1990s in the Philippines onwards. The rest of it is actually pretty flat, no, and much of that is really under Marcos if you look at it, no. So we're not trying to be biased or anything. This is just the numbers, no. So just a second, let me. Okay. Can I show my side lang? 1 second lang, bro.
Yeah.
Just the numbers, kasi I see your frustration na hindi tayo humahabol over time. My point is the crucial years were much earlier, diba? Sorry, this one, diba? This one, right? This is the crucial one for me, because the number is really shocking, bro. This, I mean, like, come on. 1962, our per capita is 495, right? By the time we reach 1986, Marcos collapsed. It's more or less the same, right? So the per capita growth is just 0.4%. Obviously, there's a population growth aspect, which is also one of the highest. Actually, it's the highest of all our peers, 2.7. All our peers are lower. No, Indonesia was half as rich as us in 1962, becomes as rich as us almost, or as poor as us in 1986. But other countries, it explodes. Japan goes from 2,000 to 16,000. Korea goes from 300 to 2,000. Malaysia goes from 800 to almost 2,000. Singapore from 1.5 to almost 7,000. Taiwan was just as poor as us, or rich as us in 1962 in per capita. They become as rich almost as Singapore. No, they pushed up to $4,000. Thailand, they were poorer than us by far, no, in 1962, and then they're significantly almost 40% richer than us in 1986. So for me, Leloy, going back to your graph, you look at it, the flatness is really those years, right?
Yeah.
So this is, for me, really the lost decades for the Philippines. 2 lost decades for the Philippines. It's amazing how, I mean, and of course, there's a concept of path dependency, Lelo, right? Like if you mess it up early on, because this is also the phase where many countries were building their base, their foundations for manufacturing, their foundations for attracting investments. So I think you were also one of the folks that mentioned we were losing on the first wave of industrialization across East Asia. So for me, this was really the crucial year. Again, I'm not giving a free pass to those who came after, especially those who messed it up big time. But I mean, for me, we lost 2 full decades under one person, more or less, right? And for me, I think that should kind of preview our discussion of Maharlika as objective as possible. No, I mean, these are just numbers, mga Nexus. No, I mean, we're not posing as economists or anything like that. Any individual who can just read and do basic arithmetic, right? You should be able to process this, and that's what I love about you, Lelo, is your argument about the fact that we should not leave it to so-called economists, professional economists, or academic economists, because this is something that average persons, anyone can read.
Wala akin naman a lot of yung technical capacity ng professional economists is kaya talaga nilang gumawa ng series, kaya nilang gumawa ng math, kaya nilang gumawa ng regression. Pero sometimes I think the interpretation of data and especially the valuation of data. In other words, when you bring in certain value judgments into your assessment, that's something that's for everyone, right? Especially because economics is, extremely value laden, diba? You choose one indicator over another that reflects your values as a person, right? And as I say, for example, me as a kind of lefty, my favorite indicator is the Gini coefficient. I want to live in a more equal society, right? And one of the things I'm waiting for with bated breath is yung pag-release ng next Gini coefficient numbers, because actually we haven't seen the Gini coefficient numbers since 2018. And actually yung problema ko nga with some of these graphs, including yung mga works na tinignan natin, hindi nila tinitignan yung rates of inequality, or hindi nila kino-compare yung rates of inequality. But my suspicion, Richard, and I really want to dig into this. My suspicion is that even in the 80s, our Gini coefficient was already bad relative to our ASEAN neighbors, right? And now, yung nakakaya nga sa atin ngayon, now we've entered already a period of sustained growth. Medyo malinaw na yan, di ba? But really, yung drop ng Gini coefficient natin, it's been dropping since the Aquino period, mostly because during the Aquino and Duterte period, talagang bumagsak naman talaga yan. But parang ang taas pa rin niya compared to our ASEAN countries. So we're
more like
ASEAN neighbors,
Latin America level.
Unequal country. And it's really, I think a lot of our political problems are really caused by the fact that we are unequal, and you cannot form bonds of social trust if you're in an unequal society.
And also kind of a progressive pressure group on the state and on the oligarchs to get their act together and push a national industrialization project, right? I think there's also some correlation there. No? Now, I just felt it's very important. We're evidence-based, so we're looking at the numbers. I completely agree with you, Leloy. We have had half a century of disappointments in the Philippines. Super disappointing yung level of per capita growth natin compared to our neighbors. Siyempre, yung context ng usapan natin, unfortunately, na-cut tayo because of some technical issues. The context was that why our neighbors, even, I'm not talking about Thailand anymore because they're already way ahead of us. Definitely not Singapore or Malaysia, but I'm talking about even just Vietnam and Indonesia, which I visited over the past few weeks in the context of ASEAN summits, etc., G20, etc. I mean, they're moving on so many fronts, including gastro diplomacy. Their food is becoming cool and globalized. Electric vehicle production by VinFast. You were saying that in next to your house, meron ng mga VinFast dealers. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible the transformation that some of our peers, real peers, no, hindi na Thailand, Singapore, have been making. But ang argument ko kasi, Lelo, is the crucial years really for me was 60s, 70s, 80s. And that's where you see it was a complete disaster in terms of GDP per capita growth. And for me, that kind of was a curse that was carried over. And nagkataon rin na hindi ganun ka-competent yung mga susunod na administrations, with some exceptions. I think Ramos did pretty okay for a few years from the very low base he was starting. Aquino didn't do too bad in terms of GDP growth rates, but you're right. Yung inequality levels didn't significantly go down. It went down, but not significantly. And our Human Development Index is still nowhere near where it should be compared to our peers. So I'm not here to say one side is good and one side is bad, but the numbers speak for themselves. We had 2 lost decades, Marcos, and compared to all our neighbors, look at it, 0.4% GDP per capita growth under Marcos. It was 5% under China, 5% in Indonesia, 8-9% in Japan and Korea. And they also had dictators. We also had dictator, but our dictator was so incompetent compared to theirs.
Yeah. I mean, if this Marcos is going to do well economically, it's because his predecessors already covered up for the mistakes of his father. That's the irony that's there, right? And I would actually, this is a very hard thing for me to say. I would actually include there Rodrigo Duterte, because Rodrigo Duterte, is a mass murderer, dami niyang pinatay, pero yung economic policy niya na, there was a journal article on development and change published by Charmaine Ramos, and she makes the point there. Here's a quote. She says that Duterte had overseen the highest level of social spending witnessed in the 3 decades beginning in 1986, with the 2017 to 2018 government social spending at its highest level for 32 years, both as part of public spending and percentage of GDP.
Is it share?
So,
okay, so it's
as a share of GDP,
So let's give
social
credit.
spending since 86, according to Professor Ramos, was highest under Duterte. So starting 2018 yun. So yun nga, hindi ko pa alam kung ano yung, a lot of people are predicting na magta-tank yung Gini coefficient after 2018.
Right.
I'm not entirely sure, because if in 2018 Duterte engaged in the largest social spending program, that could have lowered the Gini coefficient. Now, of course, after 2018, we know that in 2020 COVID happens, and we don't know how that affects the Gini coefficient. So we're not entirely sure what the legacy of this is going to be.
Sorry, I mean, I'm yet to see the exact numbers, but from what we saw, the Asian Development Bank warned of a lot of scarring, no? So marami sa ating mga kababayan, they dropped out of the high quality labor markets and are back, but really low quality employment. So that's going to make the inequality question worse. And we're seeing that, Lelo, in educational sectors.
Yeah. You know what I suspect, Richard, is if kung ni-report yung Gini coefficient ng 2019, early 2020, it would have been good news for the Duterte administration because of this particular social spending. And in a way, parang this actually explains why Duterte was still popular at the end of his term. It's not because tanga yung mga tao or wala silang pakialam sa drug killing. It's because if you have the largest social spending since 86, I mean, hindi naman tanga yung Pilipino. They respond to that kind of policy. I mean, you can call it economic populism, whatever, but it is what it is.
Let me also clarify again. Let's give credit where credit is due. No, for instance, I give credit to the Duterte administration in terms of improving our facilities dyan sa Pag-asa, among others, which we didn't do under the Pinoy administration. I kept on telling them they didn't do it, right? So we're not here to besmirch or to underplay the achievements. I want to put things into context, though, because we're talking about continuity. Under Aquino, Leloy, our fiscal space, yung budget ng gobyerno,
lumaki talaga.
Lumaki. Kaya nga, nung pumasok si Digong, ang dami niyang pera. You get what I'm saying? I'm going to give credit for him for using that money for spending infrastructure development. But in fairness, we have to give credit to the Aquino administration for creating the fiscal space. Lahat ng budget na nakuha niya na nag-carry over. Kaya nga dito, this is where, Lele, I try to be different from both camps, because there's one camp that says Duterte was horrible on every front and Aquino was great on almost every front, and then there's other camp that does the opposite. But the reality is that there were things that both got right, and we
ang hot take ko dito is actually that the Aquino and Duterte administrations are administrations of economic continuity, and that it was a decent 1-2 punch on the part of Aquino and Duterte, right? Aquino created the fiscal space. He also started many of the programs that Duterte would use so effectively in 2018, like, for example, yung 4Ps, right? And it was that combination that put us in a really good position in 2020. Then, of course, COVID happened, right? Pero economically, it was a good run for those two presidents.
And infrastructure spending went from 2 to 3% to more than 5% thanks to Joe when he was the DP. And I really welcome that. So again, we're not here to hate any. We're being fair, no? Minsan siguro we're just being over fair. That's why I had to put the context. Na in fairness naman, dahil sa savings ni Pinoy, dahil sa cutting down on the fat and excess spending, pera ni Digong, right? But in fairness naman to the Digong administration, they also did their part on infrastructure, social spending, and then they messed it up during the pandemic. We mishandled the pandemic because if you look at it, our neighbors, some of them grew. Vietnam grew, Taiwan grew, Indonesia had a negative 3%, Philippines had 10% almost GDP reduction kasi nag-overreact si Tatay Digong dun sa lockdowns and everything like that.
Yeah, so look at Gini coefficient, for example, 46.5, 2012. High yun, was a high. Tapos, by 2015, under Aquino, bumagsak to 44.6. And then under Duterte, bumagsak to 42.3. So talagang may continuity. These are the presidents who are lowering our inequality. And then, of course, yung interesting, naalala ko, sabi mo yung binigyan ni Noynoy si Digong ng fiscal space.
Yes.
The way this was covered in the media was actually an away between Butch Abad and then incoming DBM Chief Diokno. Kasi sabi ni Butch Abad, sabi ni Diokno, the Aquino government underspent, criminally underspent, right? So nagbukang away. And we're going to spend a lot more. Now, actually, if you wanted to be nice, the way you would have phrased that is hindi away. Diokno would have said the Aquino government did not spend as much. Therefore, it's giving us a lot of fiscal space. Yeah. We thank the Aquino administration for creating the fiscal space. We're going to use it now, right? So it's the same set of data, except the way they talked about it was away as opposed to continuity. And I actually think what happened was a lot more continuity.
But Domingo credited the
Dominguez,
Dominguez.
Yeah. Credited Purisima. Credited Purisima.
Because Dominguez, I remember, was it 2019 or something, one big conference said we can have a golden age of infrastructure development at salamat sa mga dating administration starting. I don't want to be unfair to Tita Arroyo. Tita Arroyo also in the late 2000s started some fiscal reforms that were carried over in a sustainable and a sincere way by the Aquino administration. Kaya nga,
yes,
meron budget. So I want to be as fair as, yung kasing problema sa atin, di ba, Lelo? Yung parang it's like binary. Bad administration, good administration. But it's 50 shades of competence and competence, right?
Yeah. It's funny nga kasi parang ang polarized ng discussion even when it comes to economics, and even the economists are very polarized magsalita. But actually, if you zoom out, and maybe you need a historian in order to zoom out. If you zoom out, from Arroyo to Duterte, hindi naman magkakaaway ang mga regime na yun eh. Don't you think, Richard?
I mean, Balisacan work under Aquino is now under
hindi sila
Marcos,
magkakaaway
right?
Economically. If you look at, every time, the DOF has reunions, meron silang mga events where they have the former secretaries there. It's extremely collegial because these are the same managers and they have the same vision for our country. And, Richard, I think more or less, a lot of them have gotten their act together. I don't care if it's, Purisima. I don't care if it's Dominguez. I don't care if it's Diokno. These guys think alike and they have a common vision for our country. Now you can critique that vision, right, but I think from Arroyo onwards, it's been rather consistent.
Pretty okay, no? Pretty okay. I would say we have had 15 years of just above mediocre macroeconomic management, which is much better than what we had for a long time. So in the 50 years that we're talking about, from 1970 to 2020, we had roughly 15 years or more of decent macroeconomic policy. I would say late 2000s under Arroyo, mid 1990s under Ramos, and then 6 years of Aquino, and then at least 4 years under Digong. No?
Tapos, I mean, just think about yung continuities there, diba? Yung Arroyo, for example, yung she promoted BPOs, right? And we think of her as the kaaway of the Dilaw now, but who was her person who helped her promote BPOs? Maroas, diba? So this kind of continuity. And I mean, Butchabad was in that cabinet also when it was doing well, right? Bumalik sila under the Aquino administration. So a lot of the good things they were doing there, they did it again. So look, parang mga Nexus, I think what Richard and I are doing here is we're trying to depolarize our country a little bit. Right? We're trying to depolarize our country and stop people from thinking. Detoxify.
Toxic ng discussion. Even economics is so toxic now. You cannot talk about inflation without being bashed. It's like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's so hard to talk even numbers now because everything is politicized, even numbers. Of course, numbers interpretation is political in many ways. I understand that, but it's so partisan na Leloy. Doon ako nahirapan. Like, I'm so careful to say, like, again, I don't want to go down this road. You know where I'm going to go. But, you know what I'm saying? Like I said, for instance, I cited the case of Turkey, which is a crazy case, just to say, you don't never know, right? I mean, in Turkey, super crazy yung policies na Erdogan. I completely disagree with the guy on every single front. At the same time, the real wages actually are not too bad in Turkey, right? That's why walang political revolt. That's why Erdogan might still make it. So it's not just inflation, but it's the real wages you have to look at. It's wages versus but it's so hard to say it because I just say that maybe inflation is at 6% is not horrible. Suddenly you're seen as elitista, insensitive. It's yun ang frustration, guys. So what I like you doing here, Leloy, is that you're saying, kung titignan mo actually mga pros, yung mga adults, matino naman sila at hindi sila nag-ahoy masyado.
Hindi sila kasing polarized at that level.
Exactly.
And you can, in a way, I think you can also critique our economic policy makers for not arguing as much because ang sasabihin ng mga kaliwa dito is that you have a common neoliberal culture among them kaya hindi sila nag-aaway, 'di ba? That's the kind of left-wing critique. I see the value of that critique, but I don't take that position. The position I take is that we have developed a group of economists who are not right-wing. Actually, it's been relatively fiscally expansive naman in a kind of moderate way. Yeah.
Joke
na especially. And then monetarily, 'di ba? Hindi na ito yung period na protect the peso at all costs. Meron they've been allowing drops on the peso to reassure the exporters na sasaluhin na hindi kayo i-abandon ng central bank. Maybe they should do it a bit more. But hindi na ito yung period ng high peso above everything else. And I think they get along. They have a common vision. And it's a vision that I think the majority of us, if we could dig into the economics, the majority of us might agree with. Although I respect, of course, yung mga colleagues natin sa left who really want a more structural change.
I see their point, but the point is like, it's a bit caricaturish because for me, there's still a significant difference between Jokno's approach to fiscal and monetary policy, both as central banker and DBM, compared to, say, Purisima, for instance, or some of the other people we're talking about. In fact, Balisacan and Jokno are not necessarily on the same page, right? For instance, Balisacan is more on PPP. Jokno still believes that the government can fund mga projects together with the international financial institutions. So many interesting things are still happening there, Lelo. So for me,
si Dominguez nga lang as a Jokno towards the tail end of the Duterte administration, parang nakikita mo nagtatalo na over the deficit because you saw that Dominguez already wanted to privatize certain industries dahil natataas siya sa deficit. Si Jokno was like growth above everything else, diba? So yes, you can make fine-grained distinctions even within administrations.
It's consequential. It's fine-grained, but it's consequential for me, no? Especially if you look at the infrastructure spending, etc. Now, we'll go to MAHARLIKA very shortly. Don't worry about it. But I really want to get down to this because ang point ko dito is, yes, it's true that they're all trained in new classical economics, whatever you want to put it, but I think they're also adjusting to realities on the ground. They're also vibing yung mga ongoing debates on social inequality, on inclusive development. Even if you look at the statements by Asian Development Bank, by IMF, World Bank, they're also shifting and changing. The World Economic Forum talks more about inequality now. Nowadays. So for me, as much as I see the leftist critique as sensible in terms of pushing for more structural reforms, I think we should not also look at current technocratic community as monolithic. They're not monolithic, right? So it's like 50 shades of neoliberalism, if you can put it that way. Which matters because it could make a lot of difference on the ground. But now, of course, going back to this, Leloy, one thing I wanted to add, actually, very interesting also see Medalla, si Philippine Medalla, he kind of made this interesting statements also on, a weaker peso could be good for our exports and actually could make our economy more competitive. Again, I'm not sure we were hearing that before, were we?
That wouldn't have happened in the 90s, diba?
Exactly.
That wouldn't have happened in the 90s because in the 90s, when a group consisting of a young Ben Diokno, Manuel de Dios, and Calixto Chicamco, and the late great Cayetano Paderanga, they made an argument for a more sustained depreciation. I'm missing someone. Sorry, I'm missing someone. I'll get it. Lima yun eh. They made an argument for a sustained depreciation of the peso.
Hernia?
At ang sagot sa kanila ng central bank at ng kaliwa. So this is very interesting was that they were engaged in jukebox economics. It was so out of the pale at that time that they were attacked from the right and the left. So the fact that Medalla is already saying that now, right? It's already significant progress on the part of our central bank. Nagbabago talaga tayo, nagbabago yung orientation. And unless mag-aral tayo ng ekonomiya, unless mag-aral tayo ng ekonomiya, if we don't leave it to just the economists, we're not going to see this as citizens. We need to see this as citizens, not mediated by economic experts, but as citizens who consume the news, because economic news is news the way political news is news, and we don't just leave political news to political scientists.
Exactly.
Right?
I don't mind economists making political analysis, especially when it's sound. No, I don't call them poser if they talk about foreign affairs or politics. So I found it really strange that some of our friends are, misunderstanding the context. But that's what I'm saying. If you talk to real economists, high quality economists in the Philippines and abroad, to bankers. Lelo, I deal a lot with bankers. I give a lot of briefing to top hedge funds, financial institutions around the world who are concerned about the Philippines, because everyone knows politics, economics intersect, no? And you have to really look at it. And thanks to historians like you, Lele, hopefully you'll be our Adam Tooze down the road. We have to look at things in a longitudinal way. Hindi yung titignan mo doon sa website ni Bangko Sentral, anong nakasulat dyan, yan na po ang katotohanan ng ekonomiya natin for forever, eternity. That's not how it works, right? You look at the evolution over time, you look at the internal debate, external debates, the dialectical interaction. There's so many factors going on, diba? So you need interdisciplinary approach. And we're not idiots, right? We do our assignments. We're entering this debate with some basic training and understanding the situation, of course. And as political scientists, we were trained to do regression and all of those things. So, mga economists, no? Anyway, Leloy, now, of course, all of this is just a warm-up. And by the way, shout out to some of our friends. I saw personally some big business folks and even pro-Marcos people saying they're listening to us. All the
Nexus, may mga
one of them said, you're too woke for my taste, but you make sense. And I like you're a cool leftist or woke or something like that. But I appreciate it. I appreciate that they listen to an hour of discussion on economics by us. And they really like yung duo natin and discussion natin. So I feel very encouraged, Leloy. And I really love this discussion. It's so interesting. So can we transition now to the man of the day or of the week or month? Sandro Marcos, who of course took his master's in London School of Economics. But just to be clear, it's London School of Economics and Political Science. So not necessarily LSE graduate ka, economist ka, no? But I didn't bother to check ano ba talaga master's niya or yung thesis niya or whatever. But clearly, Sandro is kind of positioning himself as a kind of a technocratic young guy. Some even said Macronish. Now, I won't go that far. I'm sure Macron will love something.
Please, wag naman, kuya.
Actually, a leftist said that on Twitter. And I had to kind of like, come on, like, don't stretch the Macron thing. I got bashed a lot for kind of pushing Isco to be kind of Macronish, and I'm going to be bashed for that forever. And I'm going to be, I don't mind being accountable for that and apologizing for stretching things. But going back to this, what do you think about this? Hindi lang Philippine Sovereign Wealth Fund, talaga Maharlika Sovereign Wealth Fund. Like, is this like a meme? Kasi natakot ako, baka ito na naman yung mga meme na onion, red onion, white onion. I like, totoo nga, Maharlika talaga yung ginamit eh. So Lele, can I get I mean, what was your first hot take on that?
Well, yun nga yung pangalan insulto, di ba? Because I thought early on that there was an attempt on this administration to kind of at least rhetorically distance itself from the worst excesses of the first administration, even if baka may gawin silang similar to the first administration. So, for example, hindi pinatugtog yung bagong lipunan theme nung inauguration, di ba? Ako ay Pilipino yung naging theme instead of yung bagong lipunan. Because tapos gustong i-signal some continuity pero lumalayo naman dun sa worst excesses, right? At hindi naman nagtayo si Bongbong Marcos hindi naman niya reconstitute yung bagong lipunan as a concept. Right. Pero itong Maharlika is one of the nastiest concepts coming out of the old Marcos administration because this is
ano ba itong Maharlika? Sorry. What is it?
Maharlika daw yung pangalan ng unit ni Marcos nung World War II.
Not the
unit that
Maharlika.
Yeah, well, of course, yes, because yung may history siya of the aristocracy, di ba? So, kung hindi yun yung naging pangalan ng unit ni Apolacay nung World War II, then it would have just been this concept of aristocracy, except na-associate sa talaga ni Marcos. Kasi yun daw yung guerrilla unit. And speaking of the excesses of the Marcos administration, this is where the lying really started with respect to yung history ng Maharlika. So, if you look at, for example, the book by Hartzell Spence, yung From Every Tear of Victory, the authorized biography of Ferdinand Marcos there, because we know that Hartzell Spence is really just writing the official line of the Marcos, of the Marcoses. They make the claim, Marcos and Hartzell Spence make the claim that Maharlika saves Australia. It's that absurd. Bakit daw? Kasi daw nung papasok na yung mga Hapon, single-handedly, Marcos and Maharlika, ala Rambo, rinatatak daw nila yung mga Hapon, and they slowed down the southern advance of the Japanese in the Philippines through Rambo strategy. And because napabagal nila yung approach, Marcos and the Maharlika saved Australia. That was the claim that they made. Ganun ka-absurd itong concept na to ng Maharlika. So from the name itself, napakalaking insulto na eh.
Okay. So we went from this to Talano Gold, di ba? Kaya ang tanong ngayon, ano bang susunod na fund? Talano Fund, like reserves, di ba? Yun yung tanong ngayon. To this, I mean, so what's going on here, Lele? Do you think they're like testing the waters, how much they can get away with playing with the craziest part, the most fringe aspect? Kasi Maharlika pa lang napaka-email-diffic and I'm having a hard time taking it seriously as a technocratic initiative, right? Ikaw, Lele, what's your take?
Well, ang dami, 'di ba? So of course, rine-reference yung military history ni Marcos. And then the idea of a sovereign wealth fund naman is also referencing this kind of idea of state developmentalism from the first Marcos regime as well. That's the other symbol. And I would say, to be fair, the first reference is crazier than the second reference because we just talked about developmentalism, and developmentalism obviously works. Now I'm looking at the media coverage of Maharlika. There's a decent piece on the Star about the Maharlika Wealth Fund, which talks about yung tipong pros and cons ng Maharlika Sovereign Wealth Fund. And I think by and large, parang hindi naman kasing frothing in the mouth yung approach ng Star because like everybody was saying that this is just a corruption fund, and it could be that. Pero the Star begins by saying, actually, this happens. That's one thing we should say. This is not unprecedented. This is something that's been done in Malaysia. This is something that's, of course, been done in Singapore via Temasek Holdings. And in the case of Temasek Holdings, it's been quite successful, right? So on paper, it's not a crazy idea to have a sovereign wealth fund. Now, where the problem comes in, of course, according to the Star piece is, well, unang-una, is it the right time to do it given economic conditions? Now we can have a debate, about whether or not, kasi sasabihin ng administration, well, it's 7.7+% growth, we do have the space. But ang sagot naman dyan is, we have the space, but we should use that space to continue to ameliorate the effects of COVID-19 and inflation, right? So that's one response to that. The second, more substantial response is, yes, there's Temasek Holdings, but there's the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia, of course, where a similar sovereign wealth fund was raided in amounts that are only comparable really to Ferdinand Marcos Sr.
Naging slush fund siya.
Naging slush fund talaga.
I mean, and it funded, I think, Wolf of Wall Street, which is quite an irony, right? Or not actually irony. It's like art imitates reality.
Yeah.
I don't know which is the crazier, right? The 1MDB part or the Wolf of Wall Street story. But going back to this, obviously, I mean, what's the most interesting to me, Lelo, is Amy Marcos' criticism of this proposal, right? I mean, right off the bat, the Amy Marcos question is multi-pronged, right? First of all, yes, sovereign wealth fund makes sense, but it's something that countries with surplus export earnings and exchange reserves tend to do, right? I mean, look at the biggest sovereign wealth funds, Qatar, Saudi, Singapore, China. Look at the biggest foreign exchange reserves. And then of course you have Norway also there, no? So in the case of Asia, of course, it was the Asian financial crisis that made us very traumatized. Kaya nga everyone was bulking up on their foreign exchange reserves, and the idea is that maybe more than just reserves, you want to have an active mechanism for global investments.
Sorry, pause. Naglobat ako. Sorry, I need to get my charger.
Sure. Pause. I mean, you're gonna go away or something?
Yeah, I have to go. Pause lang. I have to go. I mean, pause the recording.
Really? No, I can go on.
Live ba tayo?
Hindi naman. I mean, I can go on.
Sige.
Don't worry about it. Ako na lang magsalita on my own. Okay. Ganun naman tayo, pare. Ako rin kanina had to go. So ang sinasabi ko is, okay lang, kahit di naman makinig si Leloy, nakikinig naman yung mga ka-Nexus natin. Ang sinasabi ko is, in the case of Asia, a lot of us were so traumatized by the Asian financial crisis that we became obsessed with savings. No? But the idea was that saving and having surplus foreign exchange reserve is not enough. You want to put it in an investment vehicle that actually gets you good returns over time, at the same time gives you some cushion. No? In the case of Europe, Norway, of course, there was a Dutch disease case, whereby Netherlands, of course, once it had the discovery of natural gas, and it had huge surplus earnings, it actually affected its exports because its currency became appreciated. So Norway was perhaps somehow also influenced by the case of the Dutch disease. And then you have the Gulf Arab countries, very rich countries who were making huge profits out of their oil exports. And the idea was that, what do we do with us? Because because just north of Persian Gulf, the Shah back in the day injected a lot of extra profits into the economy, hyperinflation, created revolutions. The idea is that, okay, instead of injecting all of that super profits internally, let's put it in a sovereign wealth fund, manage it. So the Middle Easterns, the Norwegians, the East Asians, everyone had reasons to come with a sovereign wealth fund. So in theory, a la Philippine Star, no, it makes sense. But we're mostly talking about countries who are export-oriented, who have surplus funds, and wanted to avoid the Dutch disease case, or wanted to avoid another Asian financial crisis, etc. So ang tanong is does that make sense in the case of the Philippines, which is an import-oriented country? Our surplus, funds are not as much. And then, kaya nga sabi ni Amy Marcos, saan mo naman kukunin yung funds na to if it's going to come from GSIS, SSS, etc.? A lot of these guys have to take care of their own, right? And have their own internal problems. The SSS issue was a big one, no? Under Duterte, no? In terms of sustainability, actuarial sustainability. So, ang daming layers of questions, and then papasok pa yung 1MDB. Malaysia is a relatively more developed country than the Philippines, and yet they had this massive 1MDB scandal, which Amy Marcos also kind of alluded to. So that's really fascinating that you have the potential sister saying exactly the same thing I was saying right later on before I saw her comment. So for me, that in itself is an interesting thing.
Tsaka, hindi maganda. Actually, recently, hindi rin maganda even yung mga heavy hitters na sovereign wealth fund. Hindi rin naman ganun kaganda yung record nila, di ba?
Yeah.
For example, I mean, look at the Saudi Wealth Fund. Ang dami nilang binigay sa SoftBank Vision Fund, which was supposed to be the leading tech startup investor in the world. Yung SoftBank is the Japanese telco company na nag-i-invest sa mga mostly US, but also even in India, they were investing in groups like WeWork, for example. All of these big brands na super nag-crash because puro mga bolero and
Elizabeth Holmes style.
Hindi siya nag-invest kay Elizabeth Holmes, pero si Adam Newman, he invested in WeWork, for example, using Saudi money. And it's not the best show, but you can watch that show, yung Anne Hathaway show about WeWork. And you see there that itong mga sovereign wealth fund na to, madali rin silang lokohin nitong mga tech entrepreneurs, and nung nag-crash yung tech and tech is crashing now, nayari rin yung investment ng mga sovereign wealth fund. So the question now is really, especially because tech is downsizing and a lot of the sexiest investments for sovereign wealth funds were tech, diba? Where are you going to invest even now, right? The market is kind of weird, and it's in a period of transition. Now, I understand that if a person who is pro Maharlika can counter me and say, well, that's precisely the point. Kasi dahil pabagsak na yung tech, nag-shift yung market. If you have mura na, and if you have a sovereign wealth fund na magaling, alam niya kung saan yung next trend, di ba? Kasi kung pabagsak na yung trend, alam niya kung saan yung next trend. Ang problema is, gano'n kagaling ba itong sovereign wealth fund natin, di ba?
Lelo, you're giving them ideas. I won't be surprised. I'm gonna hear it. Hey, Darian, di mo maintindihan stock markets. Now is the best time to buy tech stocks, Tesla, whatever. Kabaksak na lahat ng valuations nila. I see that. Not to mention, the Saudis also do this vanity shopping. Newcastle United, they bought in Premier League, no, with their sovereign wealth fund. So we have also this. So not only scandalous, but also decadent.
Vanity oriented talaga,
vanity investments, exactly.
So yung SoftBank Vision Fund na talagang hindi naman bankrupt, na talagang siniphon off significant money from the Saudis. The point there was really not whether or not the companies were becoming profitable. It was just growth. It was just pure growth at all costs, diba? So ilagay mo yung pera mo dyan, the greater market share you have, the better. And the more charismatic the person was who was helming the company, like Adam Newman, it was better for the image of the investors because they were associating themselves with so-called visionaries. So these were vanity funds, and it's not really the right time to invest in the concept because the concept is in a weird state right now.
So parang it's not the sexiest thing because its ROI record is actually not that fantastic. right? Not to mention, we already had a lot of them missing the mark even during the Great Recession, no, 2007-8. I think we had a lot of, not necessarily sovereign, but I know the Norwegian pension funds, for instance, were invested in some of the, mga Lehman Brothers type, no, that went south. So it's not like just recently the tech bubble burst. We have multiple waves of the sovereign wealth funds getting it wrong. But the thing, kasi Lelo, is Saudi Arabia might still get away with it because it's Saudi Arabia, right? Norway and Singapore, because they're rich countries. They're really, really rich countries. And the point is that, let's say, kasi diba, ang proposed budget niya is roughly $5 billion, right? You get that wrong. Billions of dollars of money from GSIS, SSS, Land Bank of the Philippines, all of this money that could have gone to other basic necessities or actuarial sustainability would, because parang ang tingin ko kasi Lelo, may margin of error.
Kinakabahan ako.
May margin of error kasi yung mga iba to play it around. I cannot blame Newman and these people because Elizabeth Holmes got to fool Kissinger, right? Like,
Magagaling to, manggagansong to.
Wala magaling.
Maboka to mga.
Pangalan ito si Bankman, itong crypto FX guy.
Charismatic.
Exactly. They're charismatic, dorky people who kind of look like harmless and brilliant and visionary. A lot of them MIT, Stanford connection and all of that. So, my point is, meron kasi room for error yung mga mayayaman ng bansa. Para tayo, my God! Like, I'm not sure. It's like, kukunti na nga lang, kapiraso lang yung pera niya sa bahay, ilalagay mo pa sa stock market. You get what I'm saying? That's my counter-argument to you. Ikaw ay napakaliit ng savings at ang dami mong pangangailangan, tapos sabihin mo, ay, lagay natin sa stock market yan. Tama ba yan? Or make a sari-sari store or something. You get what I'm saying? That's your argument.
And ako talaga, use it on social spending.
Yeah.
Di ba, kung gusto mo talaga, we talked about Rodrigo Duterte and we talked about how Marcos wants to be kind of continuity with Rodrigo Duterte. The real continuity is expand social spending. That will create continuity between you and Duterte and also Aquino, because these were as we said earlier, these were the governments that expanded social spending. So a three government continuity in terms of increased social spending, that'd be very, very good.
Can make a difference. So, ibigay kay Tulfo? Kasi si Erwin ang in charge ng DSWD, di ba? Kasi ibigay ng Maharlika, ibibigay na lang kay Secretary Tulfo, di ba? Lalong-lalo DSWD, ang dami nilang problema ng gastos. I really like that. So, what about the hypothesis that this is distraction? This is performativity at its not finest necessarily, but this is performativity par excellence. Na, inflation, wala tayong magawa dyan. Let's come up with some brilliant na idea and distract people. What about
I think so. Pero parang, yun nga, for me, kung mataas yung inflation, the solution is, sabi mo, tataasan ko ang 4-piece. Diba? Or expand ko ang 4-piece.
Diba?
Actually, for me, yung inflation, yes, we can talk about the macroeconomics of inflation. We could talk about rates. But ultimately, rates, sasabay tayo sa US. Ang sagot talaga sa inflation, well, in the long run, unions, so that they can bargain. But actually, sa Pilipinas, ang sagot sa inflation is expand the 4-piece. Para yung pinaka nahihirapan ng inflation, meron ng caution na yun. And I don't understand why they're using this as a distraction. Instead of just saying, like, the 4-piece is a great project and we'll expand it given this time of hardship. Like, it's so freaking...
But that doesn't make Sandro look great. But Sandro will look great if it's like his idea. Do you get what I'm saying? Going back to the Macron idea, right? Again, I kind of like waved it off at first, but now I'm suddenly thinking, but what if that's the PR game? Again, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying that's one angle that critics are also looking at, that forget about all the economics of it. This is all about public relations and performativity, especially because again, I agree with you. The inflation question, I really do not like what some people are doing, which is they're bashing Marcos for everything, including things that are not his fault naman talaga, di ba? So medyo unfair naman. There are exogenous factors beyond him. There are things inherited. Parang for me, honestly, a responsible opposition is not a nega opposition. A responsible opposition is one that gives credit where credit's due and has a data-driven, proper analytically driven critique of the administration. Kasi it gives bad name to opposition. And look at how nega things are. Every time something is not good, kasalanan ni Marcos Jr. Every time something is okay, then hindi dahil kay Marcos yan. And the other side does the almost opposite, right?
Yeah.
If something is not wrong, it's not our fault. If something is good, it's only because of us. So I'm not sure this is really helping yung ating mga kababayan in terms of the level of political discourse and policy discourse we want. And at the end of the day, Leloy, di ba? Policy ang pinag-usapan eh. Kaya ikaw bilang isang historiador, meron ka masabi. Yung ekonomista, maraming masabi. Tayo rin may masabi ang mga ibang social scientists. And ako, I'll be honest about it. I feel that sometimes turfing is happening. And at the same time, let me say it again. I apologize if I seem dismissive towards some folks in the Philippines and medyo mayabang ang dating ko, because I saw in some tweets that some people were implying that I'm a bit too dismissive at inechepuera ko yung sa... No, it's not local economists per se, but some people there who are trying to make it look that sila lang, dahil may PhD sila in economics or whatever, sila lang may karapatan magsalita. For me, I'm sorry, Leloy, that's so fourth world. That's not third world. That's like, kasi in other third world, pwede pa rin eh. But this is so fourth world. Na kami lang mga PhD in economics ang may masabi sa monetary and fiscal policy. Come on, this is a joke. Kaya nga,
yeah, so we are going to continue talking about that because, like, you know, when it comes to economic policy like a sovereign wealth fund, there's a lot more than just the numbers. And there's a lot more than the technical stuff. We honor the people who produced our graphs for us. We love you. Thank you for producing our graphs. But ultimately,
thank you to accountants too for getting actuarial studies and everything.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Them, yeah.
But then pag nandiyan na yung data, pag na-process nyo na, we all talk about it collectively, right? Totoo, mahirap gumawa ng regression, mahirap gumawa ng graph, mahirap gumawa ng series. But you know, the reason bakit kayo gumagawa ng graph is not to keep it amongst yourselves. The reason bakit kayo gumagawa ng graph is so that it can generate conversations between those people, because a graph is precisely an ordering of data in such a way that more people can talk about it. And you know, don't blame us if we talk about your graphs, right? Because that's the intention of producing a graph. So I mean, let's so one aspect that isn't covered by one aspect that isn't really covered by the technicalities, and you were alluding to it, is yung symbolism of the sovereign wealth fund, of course, and yung image niya, diba? And tying it up with Sandro Marcos as an individual and the kind of symbols that Sandro Marcos wants to tap into. The symbol that obviously the Marcoses have been trying to tap into is the symbol of Singapore. Right, and
Duterte tried to
they know that Filipinos have intense Singapore envy. Right?
Yeah.
For some reason, we don't have Japan envy, we don't have Thailand envy, we don't have Korea envy. We don't even
praise, but not envy.
We don't even have Vietnamese envy. We really have Singapore envy. And of course, when you talk Singapore, you think about the brilliance of Temasek. Right? You think about the brilliance of their sovereign wealth fund, which is not like the Saudi wealth fund. Mas mahirap lokohin ang mga Singapore.
Good luck.
Ang Temasek
sila. Yeah. So, I said it as a point of praise, by the way. Baka mamaya sabihin nila that was...
Ingat ka dyan. Okay. So, yun. So I think that's the symbol that they're trying tapping into there. Balik na naman tayo dun sa issue ng Singapore envy. Now, Richard, I know you've talked about this a lot. You know, the discontents of our Singapore envy. Why is it na nagmamanifest na naman yung discontent ng Singapore envy natin dito sa particular case na to ng Maharlika Wealth Fund?
For me, the Singapore envy is strongest among new Filipino middle class, right? And the professional class. Kaya nga, ang taas ng support for Sara and Bongbong in the last elections. I argued in the Journal of Democracy piece I wrote on the return of Marcos is that this is what I call disciplinary politics. And I see Lee Kuan Yew very much as the father of 21st century disciplinary politics. No? And remember, Leloy, Japan, Korea, kailangan mo ng visa pumunta doon. Taiwan until recently. Sa Singapore, pwede ka pumunta dyan, basta meron kang konting ano lang. Pero a middle class Filipino can easily go to Singapore.
Bakasyon ka lang dyan. Oh. So, you can spend a weekend there.
Exactly.
Diba? Parang pwede ka mag-Holy Week dyan eh.
Exactly. So it's like BGC writ large, right? And tama yung point ng isang sociologist friend natin in Chicago University, right? Na parang if you look at it, the BGC...
Marco Garrido ba ito?
Marco Garrido, Dr. Garrido. If you look at it, the BGCs, all of this Makati, Ortigas, these business centers, they're you know, there is an authoritarian element there because kahit sino naman, hindi pwede, may security guard, may class element, but the middle class loves it. So for me, all of these are connected. There's a psychology behind it. And people in the PR industry, Lelo, they're even better than you and I, no? When it comes to understanding psychology and playing it, no? So they're better than us. So ako, as a just an ordinary social scientist, my understanding is that all of these are connected to each other. No, the last thing I want to say, Leloy, before, kasi parang bigla naging super serious yung discussion at puro economics. Let's have a lighthearted switch right after this. For me, the last thing I want to talk about is this. I cannot really classify Marcos Jr. as an authoritarian populist. I really can't. Like, there's just no indication in his actual policy, not branding, but actual policy. So he's not a consummate authoritarian populist, as in Duterte. What he said in the campaign, he's doing when he's, and like the drug and all. Marcos hindi. Like he of course enjoyed the Marcos branding and all, the authoritarian brand, but once he's in power, he's a very kind of moderated kind of president, far more moderate even than Duterte. So I call him technocratic populist, no? That's connected to Singapore. This idea that leave it to the government, leave it to us experts, right? Naka-ex-Oxford na ako, naka-Wharton na ako, yung anak ko LSE, and dito yung mga experts. Leave it to us and we'll take care of everything like that. No, that's what makes us a great leader. I mean, and look at it. Di ba hindi yun yung sinabi niya sa inauguration niya na dapat, don't worry, you can just sit back and let the government take care of it. No? So that's very technocratic, but he's also populist because clearly, you know, he tries to present himself as an alternative to a broken liberal establishment. He's an outsider. He has been victim of persecution, of PR's propaganda, black propaganda. So definitely you see a meeting, very interesting meeting of technocratic politics and populism. And in fact, there was a very interesting essay, very long essay, because there's a book on that, technocratic populism. It looks at even the cases of Macron, among others. And there was a very good essay I'll forward to you later on New Left Review on technocratic populism. It's a fascinating idea. And I was looking at it. This is how Marcos Jr. can be best explained and what they're doing also with this Maharlika sovereign. So the Maharlika is the Marcos Senior, right? But the sovereign wealth fund is the technocratic. It's the perfect embodiment of this technocratic. Right? Diba? Boom. Diba? Yeah. Exactly my point. This is technocratic populism par excellence. And it's not just the father, but also the son. The second and the third, I'm talking about, not the senior. Second and third. Really, it's working along that way, no? And look at Marcos Jr. He loves to talk about investors, about Elon Musk, about SpaceX. He doesn't want to talk about nitty-gritties of history and politics. And he wants to talk because he wants this image of being a technocratic expert on top of that. Yeah. And again, that's really Singapore because Lee Kuan Yew was the embodiment of philosopher king, right? He was the brilliant guy who understood things better than everyone, so leave it to him. You don't need democratic contestation and pluralism in that context. So that's where I see this going. Thank you. Actually,
yeah, but where I also see this going is I don't think it will be helpful for Sandro because everybody's asking, you know, what's the end game of the First Lady, Lisa Araneta? And my sense is her end game is she wants continuity. She wants to exclude Amy. She wants to exclude other branches of the family so that the next Marcos president will be her beloved son, Sandro.
And things are good for all her sons.
Yeah. And clearly this is bad for that project because this can only go two ways. Number one, it can fizzle out. Kasi walang pera, wala siyang kwenta. Or number two, it could end up in a massive corruption scandal, which is going to be even worse, right? And the third option, the option of success, we've already discussed why that option is highly, highly unlikely. So it is such a huge risk for Sandro Marcos to associate his kind of bid for future power on this project. Kasi I can imagine, you know, whatever, 20 years from now, tumatakbo si Sandro Marcos for president, you have a presidential debate. Tapos somebody will like bring up Maharlika Wealth Fund, gagaguhin siya about it, right? You're already providing ammunition for your future political opponents, for your future rivals. And kung ako sa kanila, strategically just back off now. It's bad politics. And it's not just bad politics, it's potentially bad for the country.
Or, you know, just let it fizzle out in the legislative way. Fizzle out yung actual. Like, just the idea is there, buzz, and then move on. Let's find something else. Talano, something like that. Maybe it's really that. Maybe it's not supposed to be taken seriously. That's why I'm essentially saying, don't worry, hindi naman papasa sa Senate. So, I don't know. So, for me naman kasi ganito, I want to end on this point. On my part, of course, you can go on. Ang point ko is, Duterte was really such an interregnum, right? Like when Duterte, year zero, right? Like year zero, So essentially, Marcos Jr. and all of these people now in power wondering, like, what can we do? Like, how far can we go? You know what I'm saying? Like, I think everyone is experimental now because Duterte just reset the whole deck. It's not the same regime anymore. We're a totally different ballgame right now. And I'm glad that so far we're more technocratic populist than authoritarian populist, right? Of course, populism is not my number one choice, but I take...
At least yung patayan hindi na kasing sama. Ako talaga yun talaga, pare, yung patayan, just the fact na hindi na dumadanak yung dugo at the levels they were during Duterte. I mean,
that's a big improvement. Exactly.
Such a big improvement already.
And it's worth. And now to say inflation is like version of EJK and drug war, I don't know. Some people perhaps would make that argument, right? But I'm not sure.
Please no. That would be dishonoring. That would be dishonoring the
lives of the people. Yeah. And we're not talking about hyperinflation of 50, 60, 70, Zimbabwe level 1,000%. Okay, we had a very technocratic discussion, right? Without being posed